Imagine you are standing in the kitchen of a 14th century English manor house. It is early morning. A fire burns in an open hearth with no chimney, and the smoke drifts upward toward a blackened hole in the roof, pooling against the rafters before it finds its way out. A woman is stirring a pot, copper, dented from years of use, its interior streaked with pale green corrosion where the tin lining has worn away. On the table behind her sits a round loaf of bread so dark and dense it could anchor a boat. In the corner, a swaddled infant lies in an oak cradle, wrapped so tightly in linen bands that only its face is visible. The child cannot move its arms. It cannot bend its knees. It has been bound this way since the day it was born, and no one in this room considers that strange. Everything in this scene, the bread, the pot, the candle guttering on the shelf, the rushes under your feet, the ale in the jug, the white paste the lady of the house will apply to her face before she receives visitors, every one of these ordinary things is doing something to a human body that no one in this century has the framework to understand. Not because these people are foolish, not because they are careless, but because they are operating inside a medical system so internally consistent, so well-reasoned, so confidently wrong, that the damage it causes will not be named for another 500 years. This is a story about the things that hurt you when no one, including you, knows you are being hurt. You need to understand one thing before we go any further, because it changes the way you hear everything that follows. Medieval Europeans were not guessing about health. They had a system. It was called humoral medicine, and it came to them from the Greeks, Hippocrates, Galen, filtered through Arabic scholars like Avicenna, translated at places like Toledo, and taught at the universities that medieval Europe itself invented. Bologna, 1088. Oxford by 1096. Paris by the middle of the 12th century. The system said that your body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and that health was a matter of keeping them in balance. Too much blood made you feverish. Too much phlegm made you sluggish. The cure was always to restore equilibrium, by diet, by purging, by draining what was excessive. It was elegant, it was logical, and it governed every decision a medieval person made about what to eat, what to drink, how to bathe, how to treat a wound, how to care for a newborn. The problem was not the reasoning. The problem was the premise. And from that incorrect premise flowed 1,000 years of daily habits, each one a small, invisible act of self-harm performed with the confidence of someone following the best available science. Start with what they ate. Or rather, start with what they ate it with. Bread was the foundation. Christopher Dyer's research on medieval English diets shows that among the laboring classes, bread accounted for 60 to 80% of all calories consumed. You ate bread at every meal. Bread was the meal. But the bread itself was not the danger. The danger was the stone. Medieval grain was ground between stone surfaces. Hand querns in poorer households, larger millstones in manorial and commercial mills. And stone, when it grinds against stone, sheds particles. Tiny flakes of granite or sandstone, invisible to the eye, mixed into every batch of flour, baked into every loaf. You ate them. 3 meals a day. For decades, Simon Mays, analyzing skeletal remains from the medieval cemetery at Warren Percy in Yorkshire, found teeth worn completely flat, ground down past the enamel, past the dentine, to the pulp cavity, in individuals as young as their early 30s. This was not decay. This was not sugar. This was mechanical abrasion. Every bite of bread was sandpaper. By middle age, a medieval laborer's teeth were worn to stubs. What followed was abscess, infection. In some cases, documented in 13th and 14th century English coroners' rolls, death from a dental abscess that spread to the jaw and neck and became sepsis. The most essential food in Europe was grinding its people down to the nerve. And no one thought twice about it, because what else were you going to eat? Now, take that bread and wash it down with something. In medieval England, the something was ale. Judith Bennett's research confirms that ale was consumed by men, women, and children at every meal, including breakfast. Estimates for daily adult consumption run to roughly a gallon a day for working men and women. If you have heard that this was because the water was deadly, you have heard a half-truth that has hardened into myth. Roberta Magnusson's work on medieval water systems documents that many communities maintained functional springs, wells, and conduit systems. People did drink water, but ale offered things water did not: calories, for bodies doing brutal physical labor; preservation, since ale lasted longer than standing water; and taste. The preference was practical, not desperate. But a gallon of ale a day, even at the low end of estimated strength, 2 to 4% alcohol, is not nothing. Over a lifetime, the cumulative stress on the liver, the disruption to nutrition, the exposure of pregnant women and developing children to daily alcohol, all of this left marks that humoral medicine had no category to describe. Anglo-Saxon medical texts actually recognized that excessive ale consumption was harmful. The recognition did not change the habit. If you could survive the bread and the ale, there was still the matter of what you cooked them in and what you served them on. Copper pots were standard kitchen equipment in households of middling status and above. Pewter plates, an alloy of tin and lead, graced the tables of the comfortable. And here is where the medieval world played one of its cruelest tricks. The wealthier you were, the more you were being poisoned. Arthur Aufderheide's paleopathological research documents that acidic foods, vinegar-based sauces, stewed fruits, wine, leached metals from copper and lead alloy vessels with every use. Tinning the interior of copper pots was a known practice, suggesting some dim awareness of the problem. But tin wore away. It was not always replaced. And so the family that could afford the best cookware sat down each evening to a meal lightly seasoned with copper and lead, ingested in doses too small to notice and too steady to escape. Peasants eating from wooden bowls and drinking from wooden cups were, in this one respect, safer than their lords. And then there were the things you put on your skin. Ceruse, basic lead carbonate, white lead, was the primary skin-whitening cosmetic available in medieval Europe. Philippe Lanois's study of French cosmetic recipes documents formulations mixing lead carbonate with vinegar and egg white to create a thick paste applied to the face, neck, and chest. A 14th century English recipe collection recommends a face wash of lead white and rosewater for daily use. Daily. Archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from medieval cemeteries in northern England has found elevated lead levels in female remains consistent not with dietary exposure alone, but with chronic topical absorption. Lead seeping through the skin of the face, day after day, year after year. The symptoms of chronic lead poisoning include abdominal pain, kidney failure, neurological damage, and here is the vicious circle that makes this item unforgettable: skin deterioration. The cosmetic destroyed the complexion it was meant to perfect. The worse your skin looked, the more ceruse you applied. The more you applied, the worse your skin became. The face consumed itself. This was not ignorance. This was the market responding to a demand that the product itself created. If that mechanism sounds familiar to you, it should. Now consider the physician. You might assume that medieval doctors, whatever their limitations, at least tried to help. And they did. That was the problem. Gilbertus Anglicus, writing around 1230, prescribed mercury ointments for skin conditions and mineral powders blown directly into patients' eyes for cataracts. John of Gaddesden, in his Medical Compendium of 1314, recommended bloodletting schedules tied to the phases of the moon and mercury preparations for ailments of the skin. These were not quacks. These were the most respected medical authorities of their era, working within a framework endorsed by every university in Europe. Mercury, quicksilver, administered orally, rubbed into the skin, inhaled as vapor. Recent analysis of mercury levels in medieval skeletal remains from multiple European sites confirms what you might already suspect. Widespread chronic exposure in exactly those populations with access to professional medical care. The resulting tremors, cognitive decline, tooth loss, and personality changes were attributed to the underlying disease, never to the treatment. The physician's confidence was absolute. The patient's trust was complete. The wealthier you were, the more doctors you could afford, and the more mercury you absorbed. Privilege was a delivery system for poison. And then, on a schedule no less regular than meals, came the bloodletting. This was not emergency medicine. Carol Rawcliffe documents that barber surgeons performed phlebotomy as routine preventive care, with the timing determined by astrological calendars. In monasteries, the practice was institutionalized. Monks had scheduled bloodletting days, the minutio, built into the calendar like feast days. They were excused from regular duties afterward. They received extra food to recover. A 15th century English medical manuscript in the British Library specifies that bloodletting should be performed multiple times per year for basic health maintenance. Spring and autumn were considered ideal. The procedure was simple. A vein in the arm was opened with a lancet. Blood drained into a ceramic bowl. A measured amount was taken. The patient went home, or back to the cloister, a little lighter, a little weaker, and assured that the excess humor had been safely removed. The cumulative effect of losing blood several times a year after year, was chronic anemia, weakened immunity, slower healing, persistent fatigue. Symptoms that humoral theory interpreted as evidence of imbalance. Symptoms that called for more bloodletting. The loop was invisible to everyone inside it. If you are a parent, the next part will cost you something. Medieval infants were swaddled. You probably know this. What you may not know is the extent. Nicholas Orme's comprehensive study of medieval childhood documents that newborns were wrapped in linen bands with their arms pinned straight at their sides and their legs pressed together, and kept this way for weeks or months, depending on region and family. The 13th century encyclopedist Bartholomaeus Anglicus explains why. The infant's body is tender and flexible, excessively moist, and without binding, the limbs will grow crooked. The logic followed directly from humoral theory. It was not cruelty, it was care. The parent who bound their child believed they were giving that child straight limbs and a proper form. Mary Lewis's bioarchaeological research has identified skeletal markers in medieval infant remains, altered hip joint development consistent with prolonged immobilization. Some household manuals specified that the wrappings should be changed only once or twice daily. The infant lay in its own waste between changes. In a world without antisepsis, in a cold room unable to move. The science was wrong. The love was real. Those two facts do not cancel each other out. They sit together, and they should make you uncomfortable, because the distance between a medieval parent following the best available advice and you following yours is not as wide as you want it to be. Somewhere around 1348, a catastrophe arrived that would make everything worse in ways no one intended. The Black Death killed roughly a third of Europe's population in 4 years. In the aftermath, the medical establishment faced a question it could not answer. What had allowed the disease in? Humoral theory offered a ready explanation. Bad air, miasma, entered the body through open pores. And what opens pores? Hot water. George Vigarello's study traces the consequence. From the 14th century onward, physicians increasingly warned against bathing. Multiple plague treatises explicitly advised people to avoid immersing themselves in water during times of disease. Public bathhouses, which had been common across high medieval Europe, Derek Keene documents 18 in Winchester alone during the 13th century, began to close. Not overnight, not everywhere, but the shift was real and documented. A civilization that had maintained a functioning bathing culture convinced itself, on the advice of its doctors, to stop. The replacement was dry hygiene, rubbing with linen cloths, perfumes to close the pores, clean undergarments as a substitute for clean skin. And the result, stretched across centuries, was exactly the outcome the doctors feared most: worsened disease transmission in populations that were now less clean than their grandparents had been. The next time someone tells you the medieval world was a dark age, remember that the darkness was not the absence of knowledge. It was the presence of knowledge that happened to be wrong, applied with rigor, enforced by institutions, and trusted by everyone. While the bathhouse doors were closing, the candles were still burning. In every home across Northern Europe, every evening, tallow candles, rendered beef or mutton fat around a rush wick, provided the only light. Beeswax burned clean, but beeswax was for churches and the rich. Tallow burned dirty. Thick, acrid, greasy smoke containing particulate matter and acrolein, a respiratory irritant that settles in the lungs. And these candles burned in houses that until the 13th or 14th century often had no chimney. The hearth sat in the center of the room. Smoke from the cooking fire rose and looked for a way out through gaps in the roof. The tallow candles added their own contribution. The family sat in this haze every evening. Charlotte Roberts and Margaret Cox, in their survey of health and disease in Britain, identify high rates of maxillary sinusitis and rib periostitis, markers of chronic respiratory inflammation, in medieval English cemetery populations. This was not a single catastrophic exposure. It was a lifetime of breathing. The air inside your own home, every night, slowly scarring the tissue of your lungs while you ate your bread and drank your ale and rubbed your face and changed the baby's wrappings and sat in the light of the one candle you could afford. There is one more thing, and it is the one that medieval surgeons argued about, which means it is the one that someone almost got right. When you were wounded in medieval Europe, the standard treatment was to pack the wound with cloth, linen or wool, neither sterilized nor reliably clean, and to keep it suppurating. The prevailing Galenic doctrine held that pus was a sign of healing. They called it laudable pus. A wound that drained was a wound that was working. Surgeons deliberately irritated injuries to promote discharge, packed them with caustic substances, and reopened wounds that showed signs of closing cleanly. Henri de Mondeville, a French surgeon writing around 1312, argued against this. He said wounds heal better when kept clean and closed. He complained that his colleagues pack wounds with irritating substances and then wonder why the patient develops fever. He was medically correct. He was largely ignored. The pus-promoting school dominated for centuries, and patients endured repeated cycles of infection, any one of which could become the sepsis that killed them. One man saw clearly. His profession chose not to follow. Here is what I want you to carry out of this. None of these habits were acts of stupidity. Every one of them followed from a medical and domestic logic that made sense inside the framework that governed it. The mother who swaddled her baby was following the best advice available. The woman who painted her face with ceruse was using the only effective cosmetic on the market. The monk who rolled up his sleeve for the barber surgeon's lancet was practicing preventive health care. The doctor who prescribed mercury believed he was healing. The family who breathed tallow smoke every evening had no alternative source of light. They were not ignorant. They were rational people operating inside a system that was confident, consistent, and wrong. And the damage accumulated so slowly that no single generation could see the full pattern. The medieval person who survived childhood and reached old age arrived there with teeth worn to stubs by stone dust, lungs scarred by decades of smoke, a liver stressed by daily ale, blood thinned by scheduled draining, skin damaged by the cosmetic meant to improve it, and organs carrying the quiet residue of lead, mercury, and copper, absorbed one meal, one ointment, one candle at a time. They had survived, but their body carried the record of everything their world believed. If you are watching this and thinking your own daily habits could never harbor that kind of invisible cost, remember the lead paint in American houses that was not banned until 1978. Remember the asbestos insulation that was considered state-of-the-art. Remember the cigarettes that doctors endorsed in magazine advertisements within living memory. The distance is not as far as it looks. There is a woman's skull from Warren Percy, Yorkshire, in a university archive. Her teeth are worn flat to the gum line. The jawbone shows abscess cavities where infection ate through the bone. She lived, by the best estimate, into her 40s. She ate bread every day of her life. She never knew what was in it. If you have thoughts on which of these habits surprised you most, or if you know of one we did not cover, the comments are a good place for that conversation. The people who watch this channel tend to bring their own reading, and that is what makes the discussion worth having. The next time you walk into a medieval cathedral, and I hope you do, look up at the vaulting and then look down at the floor. The beauty is real. The engineering is extraordinary. And the people who built it, who carved the stone and hauled the timber and lit the candles and ate the bread, carried the cost of their century in their bones. We know because the bones survive. And when we look closely enough, they tell us everything their owners never could.